So, you've decided that you might want to buy a house. Maybe you're tired of renting. Maybe you need more space. Maybe your family is growing, or maybe you're relocating and you've simply reached the point financially where you're wondering, can I actually buy a home? And then comes the bigger question. Where do I even start? Do I start looking at houses online? Do I call a realtor? Do you talk to a lender? How much money do you need? What about your credit? How much house can you actually afford? And what happens after you find the house? Those are all great questions, and that's exactly what we're going to start talking about today. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first official episode of MARSCoGroup podcast. I'm Moises Mo Arteaga with Coldwell Banker Realty here in Houston, Texas. And if you watched episode 0, you already know a little bit about me and why I created this podcast and what I'm hoping to accomplish with it. Whether you're thinking about buying, selling, investing, leasing, or simply want to better understand real estate. My goal is to take some of these complicated subjects and make them easier to understand. And throughout this podcast, we're also going to bring in other professionals into these conversations. Lenders, inspectors, title professionals, insurance professionals, contractors, and other vendor professionals who work within real estate transactions every day. Because there's a lot more involved in buying or selling a home than simply finding a property and signing a contract. And I want this podcast to help explain not only what happens, but also why it happens, who is involved, and what their role is. But before we get into today's main topic, let's take a quick look at what's happening in the market. There's been a lot of economic information coming out lately, and sometimes the headlines can sound pretty concerning. The latest July employment report showed that the United States lost approximately 23,000 jobs, and previous job growth estimates for May and June were revised lower. Obviously, that's something worth watching, but there's another side to that report. Unemployment remained relatively low at approximately 4.1%. Average hourly earnings were also approximately 3.2% higher than a year ago, while average working hours remained relatively stable. So while employers appear to be slowing down their hiring, we're not necessarily seeing widespread layoffs or workers suddenly losing significant amounts of income. Because people don't necessarily buy homes based on how many jobs were created nationally during one particular month. People buy homes when they feel reasonably confident about their own employment, their own income, their finances, and their future. And that's something we're going to come back to later in today's episode. Of course, we also need to talk about mortgage rates. According to Freddie Mac's latest weekly report, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate reached approximately 6.69% as of August 6th. That followed several consecutive weeks of increases. But something interesting happened this past week. Mortgage rates experienced a slight temporary reprieve, and borrowers responded. According to the Mortgage Bankers Association, overall mortgage applications increased approximately 3.6% for the week ending August 7th. Purchase mortgage applications increased and refinance activity increased as well. Now here's why I think this is interesting. It's not necessarily the 3.6% number itself that matters, it's what the response tells us. There are buyers out there paying attention. Even a relatively small improvement in borrowing conditions was enough to bring some borrowers back into the market. At the same time, we need to keep that information in perspective. Overall mortgage demand remains softer than it was a year ago, and rates can change quickly. So I'm certainly not saying rates drop a little, everybody needs to buy a house. And I'm also not saying rates are close to 7%, no one should buy a house. What I'm saying is know your numbers, understand your options, and be prepared. Because if borrowing conditions improve, if a seller adjusts their price, if inventory gives you more choices, if there's another opportunity to negotiate seller's concessions, or if simply the right property becomes available. Being prepared allows you to take decisions based on your circumstances rather than scrambling at the last minute. And here's something else consumers should understand. The Federal Reserve does not directly set mortgage rates. The Fed influences broader financial conditions, but mortgage rates are affected by the bond market, inflation expectations, economic conditions, and another of other factors. We're going to dedicate much more time to this subject in an upcoming episode when we talk about lending. But for today, here's what I want you to remember. Don't build your entire home buying decision around trying to perfectly predict interest rates. None of us know exactly where mortgage rates will be in 3 months, 6 months, or a year from now. Instead, let's determine whether buying makes sense for you under today's circumstances and make sure you're prepared if an opportunity presents itself. Now, let's bring it home to the greater Houston area. And there's actually some encouraging information here. Houston continues to maintain an affordability advantage compared to other major metropolitan areas. Recent data showed consumer prices in the Houston area increased approximately 0.8% year over year in June, compared with approximately 3.5% nationally. And housing is a major reason for that difference. Greater Houston's shelter costs were essentially flat and even showed a slight year over year decline. Meanwhile, the Houston area's median home sales price in June was approximately $347,000, slightly lower than the previous year. But Houston isn't standing still. Greater Houston added approximately 39,700 jobs over the previous 12 months, and our region continues experiencing population growth and migration. We're also seeing tremendous developments moving farther into suburban areas, including areas of Montgomery County, Fort Bend County, and other parts of Greater Houston. Houston has something many major metropolitan areas simply don't have: room to grow. And our availability to continue developing houses is one factor that helps Houston maintain some level of affordability compared with other major markets. What does that actually mean for you? And this is where I want to bring the numbers back to reality. If you're considering buying a home, I don't want you hearing a statistic and immediately thinking rates are too high, I shouldn't buy, or rates just moved down a little, I need to buy immediately. Neither statement necessarily applies to you, because there really isn't one single Houston real estate market. A $300,000 house in Katy can actually behave different from a condominium in Montrose. A property in the Greater Heights area can behave differently from something in, let's say, Cypress, Sugarland, Pearland, or even the Woodlands. Different neighborhoods, different price points, different inventory, different buyers, different negotiating opportunities, different circumstances. Real estate is local, but even more importantly, real estate is personal. And that's why I don't believe the most important question is this the perfect time to buy? A better question might be, am I financially and personally prepared to buy if the right opportunity presents itself? Which brings me directly into today's conversation. I want to buy a house. Where do I start? One of the biggest mistakes I see prospective buyers make is starting with the fun part. They start looking at houses, and I understand why. That's exciting. You get online, you start scrolling through the properties, you find the kitchen you love, you see the backyard, maybe there's a pool back there. You start imagining where your furniture is going to go. Maybe you've already moved in mentally, but we may be getting ahead of ourselves, because my advice is don't start with a house, start with a plan. Step 1, why do you want to buy? Before we discuss credit scores, mortgage rates, or neighborhoods, I want to understand something much more simpler. Why do you want to buy a home? Maybe you're currently renting and you're ready for something of your own. Maybe you need more space. Maybe you're downsizing. Maybe you're relocating for work. Maybe you're thinking about school districts. Maybe you want a yard. Maybe you're looking for stability. Maybe you're thinking building long-term wealth. Or maybe somebody simply told you you should buy a house. Those are very different reasons. And your reason for buying helps us determine what kind of property we should be looking for, where we should look, and whether buying right now actually makes sense. Then we need to discuss your timeline. Are you trying to move in within 30 days, 3 months, 6 months, next year? There's nothing wrong with starting the conversation early. I actually prefer it, because the earlier we identify potential obstacles, the more time we have to work on them. Step 2, understand your financial position. Next, we need to understand where you are financially. And this doesn't mean you need to have perfect finances. It means we need to understand them. What's your income? What recurring debts do you have? What is your credit? How much have you saved? What do you potentially have available for a down payment and closing costs? And there's another question that I think is extremely important. What monthly payment are you comfortable with? Notice I said comfortable with. Not simply, what's the maximum amount somebody will lend me? Those are two completely different questions. Just because you may qualify for a particular purchase price doesn't necessarily mean that's the payment you want every month. You still have a life outside of your mortgage. You still have utilities, vehicles, food, children. Maybe you like to travel. Savings on top of everything else, as well as those unforeseen emergencies and everything else life throws at us. I want my buyers to purchase something that makes sense for their overall financial life, not simply something that they technically qualify to purchase. Step 3, talk to a good lender. And that's where a knowledgeable lender becomes extremely important. Before we seriously start touring homes, we generally want buyers speaking with the lender and understanding their purchasing power. The lender is going to help us understand things such as your income, credit, debt to income ratio, assets, loan programs that you might qualify for, down payment options, estimated closing costs, and ultimately what you may qualify to purchase. Depending on your circumstances, there may be conventional financing, FHA, VA financing eligible for veterans and service members, and other programs that may be available. And this is exactly why I don't want somebody automatically assuming I don't have 20% down, so I can't buy a house. Talk to a professional first. Find out what's actually possible. And there's another benefit. Once we find the right house, having your finances already organized puts us in a much better position to write a serious offer. And today's mortgage demand news actually reinforces this point. When borrowing conditions briefly improved last week, borrowers responded. The buyer who has already spoken with the lender and understands their numbers is in a much better position to evaluate an opportunity than someone who has to start the entire financing conversation from scratch. You don't have to predict the market, you need to be prepared for the market. Step 4, meet with your realtor, me. Once we understand the financial side, now we can start building the actual home search strategy. And this is where I want to learn about you. Not simply how many bedrooms. I want to know, where do you work? What's your commute? What areas are you considering? Do you need 3 bedrooms or 4? 1 story or 2 stories? Do you want new construction? Are you comfortable with an older property? How important is the yard? What about an HOA? Do you want something completely remodeled, or are you willing to make improvements? What is a necessity? And what's simply something you'd like to have? Because almost every home search eventually becomes a conversation about 3 things: needs, wants, and compromises. The goal isn't necessarily to find a mathematically perfect house. The goal is to find the property that best fits your needs, finances, and long-term plans. Step 5, building your team. Something else buyers sometimes don't realize is how many professionals can actually become involved in a real estate transaction. You're going to have your realtor, your lender, potentially a home inspector, a title company, and then insurance professionals are definitely involved, an appraiser, and depending on what comes up during the inspection, we may speak with roofers, HVAC specialists, electricians, plumbers, foundation specialists, and other vendors. And over the course of this podcast, I'm going to introduce you to many of these professionals. We're going to sit down with them, we're going to ask them questions, we're going to talk to them about what they actually do, and more importantly, when do you need them and why? Because part of my responsibility as your realtor isn't to pretend I'm an inspector, lender, attorney, appraiser, or contractor. Is to help you navigate the transaction and know when we need an appropriate professional involved. Let me give you something I've learned from working with buyers over the years. Sometimes people contact me because they've already found the perfect house. They've been browsing online, they see something they absolutely love, and now they want to see it immediately. And sometimes we absolutely can. But when we discover that they haven't spoken with the lender yet, they aren't sure what their monthly mortgage payments would be, they don't know their estimated closing cost, maybe there are things on their credit that need attention, and suddenly we're trying to solve everything at once while the property they love is sitting on the market. That's unnecessary pressure. I'd much rather have the conversation weeks or even months beforehand. That way, when the right property appears, we're not asking, can we do this? We're asking, is this the right property, and what strategy should we use to pursue it? That's a completely different position to be in. So here's today's Mars Pro tip. Don't start with a house, start with a plan. Know your goals, understand your finances, talk with a knowledgeable lender, build a relationship with your realtor, yours truly, and understand your options before you fall in love with the property. Preparation doesn't take the excitement out of buying a home. Preparation puts you in a better position to actually get the home when the right one comes along. And I'll add one more thing. So here's today's Mars Pro tip. Don't start with a house, start with a plan. Know your goals, understand your finances, talk with a knowledgeable lender, build a relationship with your realtor, yours truly, and understand your options before you fall in love with the property. Preparation doesn't take the excitement out of buying a home. Preparation puts you in a better position to actually get the home when the right one comes along. And I'll add one more thought to that today. You don't have to predict the market. You need to be prepared for the market. So what's next? And that leads perfectly to our next episode, because I mentioned lenders quite a bit today, but what does a mortgage lender actually do? What do they look at? What affects your buying power? What's the difference between being pre-qualified and pre-approved? How much money do you actually really need? What determines your interest rate? And what happens if your credit isn't quite where you'd like it to be? We're going to start breaking down those questions in episode 2. What does a lender actually do? Understanding pre-approval, credit, and buying power. And I also want to bring lending professionals onto the podcast so that you're not simply hearing these things from me. You'll actually hear them directly from people who work with financing every day. We'll discuss mortgage rates, credit, different loan programs, down payments, closing costs, and hopefully clear up some of these misconceptions that can prevent prospective buyers from even beginning the conversation. Thank you for spending some time with me today on the MARSCoGroup podcast. I'm Moises Mo Arteaga with Coldwell Banker Realty here in Houston, Texas. My goal with this podcast is simple: to help you become more educated, more prepared, and more confident when making your real estate decisions. Whether you're thinking about buying next month, 6 months from now, next year, or simply trying to better understand the process, it's never too early to start asking questions and developing a plan. If you found today's episode helpful, follow or subscribe so you can join us as we continue to walk through the real estate process together, step by step. And if you have a real estate question you'd like me or one of my future guests to answer, leave it in the comments or reach out to me directly. Your question may even become a subject of a future episode. Until next time, remember today's Mars Pro tip: don't start with a house, start with a plan, and remember, you don't have to predict the market, you need to be prepared for the market. I'm Moises Mo Arteaga with MARSCoGroup and Coldwell Banker Realty, assisting you throughout the greater Houston area and beyond, and helping you make your move with confidence. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.